The indigeneity that we all need to reconnect to is how we feel about place, how we see the world, those value sets that drive us, what it means to live in a collective space and to think about people around us and beyond ourselves.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. This is a show about regenerative finance, exploring pathways to a life-affirming economy. I'm your host, Matthew Monahan, and today's guest is Melanie Mark-Shadbolt. Melanie is the CEO of Tira Whakamātaki, or TTW for short. TTW was established to bring a Māori lens into biosecurity, which is a critical issue for the island nation of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Melanie shares examples of how this looks in practice, and I really appreciated the one about Kauri Dieback and whalebone. This anecdote really challenges me and stretches my imagination as I think about topics like climate change and biodiversity. This goes well beyond biosecurity. As Melanie points out, it's about having a holistic worldview and approach to the interconnected problems facing our communities and recognizing the foundations of treaty partnership that established this country. I found Melanie's reflections to be both concise and potent. And so whether you're Māori or Pākehā, live in Aotearoa or another place in the world, I think this is a rich discussion that has something for everyone. It's my privilege to bring you this episode with Melanie Mark-Shadbolt. Kia ora, Melanie.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thanks for doing this. Maybe just to start, if you want to introduce yourself.
Of course, ko wai au, he uri au o Ngāti Parau, rātou ko Ngāti Kahanunu, te arawa, te Aotearoa, whakatohia, tūwharetoa, rangatane and raukawa hoki, also Ate Gun, Ate Macintosh, so I'm a descendant of multiple tribes here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and on my mum's side I whakapapa into Scotland and Ireland. She's a very staunch Irish Catholic woman, and I live in the embrace of Ngaitahu, my husband's tribe at the moment, so that's who I am.
Great. And you're one of the founders and chief executives of Tira Whakamātaki.
Aye.
Did I get that right?
You did. Good job.
Can you tell us about TTW?
Yeah. Well, many, many years ago, I was an academic at Lincoln University. I always tell people I wasn't a very good academic, in large part because I'm a bit of an actionist. I prefer to do things and to contemplate. And one of the programs I was working on was Kauri Dieback, and as one of many biosecurity programs I was working on. And there were a handful of Māori academics in that space at the time, and we were inundated with work and questions about Māori values and Māori views around biosecurity more broadly. And we decided that it was inappropriate for us as academics to be speaking on behalf of all Māori. And so we ran a program where we toured the country and we spoke to our whānau and our friends and asked them if there was a need for a Māori biosecurity network. We used case studies. We said, if foot and mouth arrived, this is what it could mean for the Māori economy, given that most of our investment is in farming and in forestry and the like. And we also used myrtle rust as an example and said this is a plant pathogen that could get here, or plant rust that could get here. And if it hit, it would take out many of our taonga or sacred trees, plus our mara, our gardens. And what would that mean for us, and how would we want to respond? And do we need a biosecurity network to help us do that? And our community said yes, they did. And we established Te Tira Whakamātaki. It was established and led by our elders, by our kaumātua. In 2017, it formally established, and it is now an environmental not-for-profit that's much broader than just biosecurity, but it has its heart and its foundations in biosecurity. And Te Tira Whakamātaki, it kind of means the watchful ones, and that's our job, is to keep an eye on the system to make sure that it's providing for Māori, but also to make sure that we are protecting our environment and watching our borders for incursions as well. Yeah.
And for those overseas, can you provide some context on why biosecurity is extra sensitive to Aotearoa?
Yeah, we're an island nation, and our environment has grown in isolation from many of the large predators and very many mammals. We have a bat and that's effectively it. We have many, many flightless birds, and we have lots of plant species that are quite sensitive, especially if you think about our conservation seeds. We don't even understand a lot of the behaviour. I think we don't understand something like about 75% of how our conservation seeds behave. So we have a really sensitive environment. So anything that comes over the border is going to have a detrimental impact on our environment quite quickly. We also have a bias towards protecting our borders from agricultural primary production incursions and not so much from conservation. So we made a decision really early on into Tira Whakamātaki that biosecurity was the foundation of environmental practice and of protecting our biodiversity. You can't protect the biodiversity if you're not protecting the shores and stopping things come over the line. Many things you can't stop blowing over on the wind or floating in on the sea, but you can have a program that's constantly monitoring and looking for incursions. And of course, as the Māori economy grows, now estimated to be around $70 billion, most of our Māori investment is based on the environment as well, whether it's primary production, forestry, aquaculture, but even our fashion and our film is moving into the environmental space. Our fashion is based on natural fibres, our film is based on our environment. So we know that incursions have not only the ability to decimate our biodiversity, but also our economy.
Yeah. And you mentioned Kauri Dieback, and I know you have kind of a unique Indigenous lens into that particular issue. Wondering if you can kind of unpack that a bit more.
Yeah, well, Kauri trees are a significant tree for Māori. They're a conifer of types, but they're very large and they're very old. And our Kauri forests in New Zealand are remnants of ancient forests, and our Kauri logs that we drag out of swamps date 50,000 years plus in age. So they are very old and very important trees. They also represent Tāne Mahuta, our god of the forests, the god who also separated Rangi and Papatūānuku and created the space for humans. So they are significant, especially to the tribes whose lands they are on. And they have been, for about the last 20 years, fighting a phytophthora. And phytophthora are common across the world, but this one is different. This one targets Kauri, and it effectively shuts the water transfer system down, and so the tree starts to die. And they become petrified. They remain in place, but they are dead for all intents and purposes. And Kauri are not only significant because of their cultural standing, but they're also a key species in our environment. They house something like 20 unique species just to Kauri. So if we lose Kauri, we not only lose the tree, but we lose all of those species that rely on it, including the Kauri snail and the like. So very significant key species in our ecosystem. For about 20 years, the government's been looking at ways to address this phytophthora or this disease. And by and large, we haven't had much success in the science space. We have had lots of social programs that keep people out of the forests, lots of social programs to keep people on walkways and out of the forest itself. Kauri roots are very sensitive. They are quite shallow, and if you walk on them, you can damage them. You can also transfer the disease on your boots and on any equipment you've got or vehicles. So we've had lots of those kinds of programs. Understanding the disease itself has been quite hard and quite complex. It's a very complex little phytophthora or little disease bug, and it has multiple life stages that you have to kind of break all of them to kill it. And for all of that time, for 20 plus years, Māori have been asking to be part of the research, to be part of the solution, to find solutions based in their knowledge and in their understanding of the forests. And about 10 years ago, we finally got funding into Māori research, or into research that was based on our mātauranga, our knowledge. And we believe that we've had the most success where we've worked at that nexus between Indigenous knowledge and science. And sometimes where we've just worked in the Indigenous knowledge space. So at the nexus between the two, where we've had success, it's been where our molecular scientists have had a really inspiring idea around how they might be able to stop the bug moving through the soil. And with the help of elders and with the help of tohunga, or our expert knowledge holders, they've been able to find plants that help slow down the bug or have, killed it. So at that nexus between science and mātauranga or Indigenous knowledge, we find a solution in what I would say is in a way that accelerates innovation. It's a reduced time frame. So we believe that the mātauranga accelerated the innovation. It reduced the time that scientists would have taken to find that solution. When we invest just in Indigenous knowledge, we've also found solutions based in traditional medicines. So our elders and our knowledge holders look at the tree and they try and understand the whole system that the tree operates in, who are its family, who are it's related to, who's meant to be in the forest with it, and look for the missing family members, which trees are no longer prevalent. They also look for the whakapapa or the genealogical or taxonomic connection between the tree. And so in our storytelling, there are stories that connect the kauri to the tohora, the whale. So we believe at this time of creation, the very first thing that was created was sound. And as sound hit the earth, it broke off into many species. And two of the species were the whale and the kauri, and they were brothers, and they lived on land together. And then the kauri decided that it was going to stay on land while the tohora was going to go into the ocean and explore. And when the tohora came back to the land, he said to his brother, it's beautiful out there, come join me. And he said, no, I'll stay here. And so the tohora took off his skin and wrapped it around the kauri for protection, which is why the kauri's skin or the tree bark looks so similar to the tohora. So in our approaches to environmental solutions, we look for those genealogical connections and then ask, is there a solution in the whale that will help the kauri? Do the brothers need to be reunited? Is there something in that genealogy that might help? And very much take a human health-based approach. What would you do if it was a human? You might look for solutions in the family or in the family's DNA or in their health. And through the creation of a solution, a balm using whale oil and whale bone, and the creation of a tea using the plants that are missing from the environment, we have trialled what we call rongoa approach across Northland, and we believe that we have seen what we call kauri order. So kauri order is the returning of health to the kauri forest, well-being. We wouldn't argue that we've eradicated the disease, and we wouldn't argue that we've cured it. We just say that our forests are healthy once again, and that's all that matters is forests, healthy kauri forests.
Beautiful. We have a young kauri tree right outside here. And
nice.
Yeah. When I first came to these lands, I was told about the significance of the tree and, these forest giants.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying is that Mātauranga Māori has a lot to offer in how we think about these biosecurity, biodiversity types of issues, as well as, much more broadly than that. Can you talk more about Mātauranga, what it is, what it means to you, maybe especially people who are newer to some of these ideas?
Yeah. Mātauranga is a really interesting word in itself, in that it's relatively new to Māori as well. Mātauranga is translated as knowledge, and it's often used with this idea that it has to be old or traditional knowledge, but it's not. It's knowledge that's both old, new, or yet to come. But it's also a word that wasn't largely used by Māori. Māori would use the word like mōhiotanga. I know these things I know. And mōhiotanga is more about that esoteric I know, like it's something that resonates with me and I understand it in my being. Whereas Mātauranga is more something I've learned. It's something that I know because I've read it to be true or I've been told it's to be true. Either way, we've kind of adopted it as our phrase now here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to refer to knowledge that is unique to Māori, both old and new and potentially future knowledge. But for us, more than anything, it's a way of thinking about the world that is more than just the widget or the reductionist approach. It's a challenge to us to think about whole systems, whole environments, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, all those key catchwords that we like to use, and how we think about bringing different knowledge sets and disciplines together to look for solutions. And in the environmental space, that means looking beyond just a discipline of biology or a discipline of ecology. It means that we have to include our social sciences as well, and all sorts of knowledge sets. And they don't always have to be Māori, but they're usually grounded in Māori ways of seeing the world and Māori ways of knowing.
You have a tagline at Tira, Whakamātaki, Indigenous Solutions for a Better Planet.
Yeah.
And so can you share more? What's like another one of these solutions, case studies, kind of projects that you've been working on through this lens?
Yeah, lots of projects and lots of ideas around Indigenous solutions, of course. And many of our communities have their own. So we know that Aotearoa, one of the communities in Aotearoa, New Zealand, have been working on Uwhi Mats to prevent weeds in their lakes. And Uwhi Mats is kind of a pushback on using plastics in our ocean, or in our waterways when we have invasive weeds. And typically, our approach is to cover them with polythene and kill off everything.
Totally.
And of course, Māori are not open to killing off everything in the system. Uwhi Mats is a throwback to the times when our weavers would create mats, a mat that was for either sleeping on or for protecting the land. And so we now have divers, and we have weavers making huge amounts of mats, and divers diving down into our lakes and our rivers to lay these mats to suppress weeds, but also in the degrading of the Uwhi Mat, of the harakeke, we create little micro ecosystems for our species, our water species, to survive and to feed off of. That's just one approach. There are many others, and we lean on other Indigenous solutions as well. And so recently we also have had conversations with Aboriginal mobs in Australia about how they traditionally hunt their species, their Wallabies, their Possums, which we consider pests here. And we have a real need to eradicate at pace, or to suppress at pace. But we're struggling with ways to do that are sustainable, that are humane, that are ethical and align with our values. And so we look to other Indigenous peoples to give us ideas on how they have sustainably harvested in the past, and to see if those practices can be adopted here, maybe altered a bit for our environments, but utilised here. And we've had success with Wallabies, where Aboriginal mobs have talked about the times when they would harvest and how they do that in springtime when it's, mating season and the Wallabies' minds are elsewhere. They also do it at early morning in the sunrise when people, the wallaby are dazed, and they use smoke to disorientate them. And so they talk about the processes and the times when they would cull, and encourage us to experiment with those here in Aotearoa. Yeah.
Nice. And you recently hosted an event around restoring the possum. Yeah. I know folks from our team at Mangaroa Farms attended and really enjoyed it. And I think part of what I heard reflected from that conversation was, putting into context the colonial nature of when these species were introduced.
Yeah.
And so can you share more about that?
Definitely. The possum has a really bad rap in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and it's kind of sad in one way. It's not the possum's fault that it's here. It was a tool of colonisation. It was brought over to create an industry. And then, of course, like many species that were brought here, got out of hand or really relished a predator-free environment at the time, and their numbers have exploded, and they are detrimental to our forests and to our birds. And so they're not in the right place for us, but that's not their fault. And yet they've been demonised in our need to eradicate and in our desire to eradicate, and in that fortress kind of conservation approach we've taken, where we use military-type language when we talk about eradicating and suppressing and holding the line and moving the front and all of that, and we count kills and all of those things that are not in line with our values in the Māori space of how we treat nature, even if it is a pest. And we wanted to have that conversation with our communities, with our possum hunting communities in particular, about their feelings towards eradication of possums, given that we know they're sacred to our Aboriginal brothers over in Te Whenua Moemoeā in Australia. And we wanted them, the Aboriginal mobs, to be able to tell us about the importance of the possum to them, to help us understand their connection to it and their loss of cultural practice due to the eradication of the possum in their lands. And for them, it's a different eradication story. It is a colonial government coming into areas that are important to possums and establishing towns and cities that have reduced their habitat. And now, of course, their numbers are so dwindled that they are unable to hunt them. And, it's legislated against hunting possums. So we have almost the dichotomy of stories happening on one side of the ocean, where we have too many possums. We can't eradicate them fast enough. They are decimating our forests, and we've had no say in their arrival, and they've had no say in their arrival. And on the other side of the ocean, our Aboriginal brothers and sisters are unable to practice their cultural traditions around possum harvesting and cloak making for their families. So the conversation was, one, how do we feel about the language we use of the possum? How are we feeling about constantly eradicating them and this focus on killing? How can we support Aboriginal brothers and sisters to revitalise their cultural practices by sending skins back to them? And then how can we also start to challenge the Crown or the Department of Conservation around the decisions they make on pest eradication, who does it, where it's done, how it's done, and the like, and the language that they use around that in particular.
And I guess one timely thing that's happening in that space right now, or related to that space, is Jobs for Nature.
Yeah.
Can you share more about what's going on there?
Yeah, Jobs for Nature was a response to the COVID crisis and people finding themselves out of work. It was from our perspective, a really good move by the government at the time to recognise that the work that people do in the environment is work that's vital and should be paid. Because by and large, most conservation work is unpaid. Most of it's done by community groups and individuals who feel passionate about their place, about their river, or about their forest. And Jobs for Nature was a way of getting people on the ground to not only hold the line in terms of preventing biodiversity loss, but also to start pushing the line and to start making real progress on reversing that decline. So Jobs for Nature saw about 1,800 people all across New Zealand employed to work on the ground protecting and restoring nature, whether that was eradicating possums, whether that was cleaning up waterways, whether it was protecting the borders of a zoo from pests getting into the enclosures. There were all sorts of jobs that were created that were about protecting nature and employing people at place. And importantly, it was about employing people at place. And what we've seen is lots of people return home, and for Māori, who are about 45% of that job makeup, so about 900 of the people employed are Māori, it was an opportunity to return back to your place, back to your homelands, to not only protect the environment, but to also reconnect. And colonisation has certainly disconnected many Māori from their whakapapa, from their genealogy, from their communities, from their marae. And this was an opportunity for Māori to also reconnect. And we have amazing stories about people in groups like the Tauranga Moana group, or in the Taranaki Maunga group, which I know you've talked about before, reconnecting to place, relearning their cultural practices, relearning who they are and where they come from, all while protecting nature. And of course, that program has now run its course and the government has decided not to reinvest. And so in about 30 days' time, we'll have 1,800 people who will no longer be working for nature and getting paid to do so. And of course, that will mean that we have the potential for some pretty big, issues in the biodiversity space.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been pretty heart-wrenching to see the speed in which budgets are being cut across nature-based research and implementation programs. And we're seeing it just from our little microcosm of the world in terms of funding requests. It's really just makes me scratch my head given everything that's happening.
Yeah, us as well. Yeah, I mean, it's ironic that we're talking today when Māori are marching on Parliament to challenge this budget, as you say, to challenge the prioritisation of, I guess, individuals and the prioritisation of capitalism over nature and over people and over communities. And it's not surprising in my mind that this is happening right now. I think it's part of a movement globally to hold on to the vestiges of capitalism and to hold on to the last of the patriarchy and the like. And I think it's our turn in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We've been quite protected from what we've seen happen across the globe. And this is our turn. I kind of hope that our communities will stand up like they are today and say that this is not us. This is not, these are not our values. Our values are nature first. In the year 2000, a very large marketing company came to New Zealand and they did a survey on what makes a New Zealander a New Zealander. And they did it for Massey University, that was their employer, and it was trying to understand what were the drivers of Kiwis. And it was, part of a marketing plan. But unsurprisingly, the very first thing that all New Zealanders said made them a New Zealander was their connection to land. And we see that over and over again when we're looking for investment in New Zealand, when we're looking for stories. Here, New Zealand roll out the Taiao program. We're connected to place. We brand ourselves as 100% pure. We sell the Māori story. Come here, we're a bicultural community. We are passionate about place. We're hunters, we're hikers, we're fishermen and the like. So we sell that as who we are in New Zealand, and now we have to see people stand up and say that that is actually who we are and that we prioritise that first. So it's also a really good opportunity to really challenge us as individuals to stand up and to kind of put a stake in the ground and say, yes, this is important to us and we will hold the government to account.
Yeah, you mentioned kind of the last vestiges of capitalism and patriarchy, and you've been a part of this chorus of voices alongside the likes of Dr. Jessica Hutchings of, calling for a more Indigenous feminist perspective in this time. Can you share more about, your frame on that? Yeah,
I guess I didn't grow up as what we call a tūturu Māori, a hardcore Māori. We have this kind of belief in New Zealand that Māori had a softer ride than other Indigenous communities, that when the colonisers arrived, they saw Māori as the noble savage, and that's written in our books. And so the noble savage who was already farming, therefore, could be reasoned with, and we could have, discussions with, and they could make decisions about their future. So there's this kind of naive belief that New Zealand has had a very soft colonial journey. And part of that story is that we haven't had our own stolen generation, or we haven't had some of the atrocities that have happened in other countries. And that's not true. Over the hill from where we are, there was a huge generation. There was a big generation of children that were removed from their homes, and they were removed maybe because their families were having issues, but largely because it was part of this approach of removing Māori and putting them into other homes so that we could, whittle out, this Māori problem. And my father was part of that generation. So my father was removed from his home and he was put into Pākehā or non-Māori foster homes and moved from home to home and separated from his siblings and his parents. And so he grew up with this view that if you discarded your Māoriness, you could get ahead in the world. And being Māori never helped anyone, or didn't help him in particular. His language hadn't helped him. When he needed to know who he was, his Māori family didn't turn up and claim him and tell him who he was. And so he had a very strong view that was anti-Māori, even though when you look at him, he's very obviously Māori. And that was very much because of his upbringing. And so when I came home from school and said I'd signed up to learn how to speak Te Reo Māori, he told me that was a waste of time and I didn't need to do that. In fact, I had lived in the Middle East with my father for a while, and he said, you've got more, better use of keeping your Arabik alive than learning our language. So we had this really warped view of what Māoridom was, and I see that across my family as well, across my cousins, that there are these stereotypes of being Māori means that you beat your children, being Māori means that you're a bad parent, being Māori means that you're a drug addict or an alcoholic, you're going to be poor, and that we're no better at looking after the environment than anyone else. And all of those things are very much still a part of who we are. And so there is a growing movement, and Jess is one and I'm another, who are trying to decolonise ourselves and decolonise our families. And when you have children, and I had children very young, when you have children, you all of a sudden start to reprioritise the things that are important. And for me, that was decolonising myself and decolonising my family so that my children wouldn't be raised with this view that being Māori was a bad thing and that there was no benefit in speaking our language and there was no benefit in knowing who we were, where we came from, and what our knowledge was. And so I think the movement is that many people are trying to reclaim, who they are in themselves. And I see that also in my mother, who's, as I said, staunchly Irish Catholic. And she also has this desire to understand who she is and where she comes from and what that means to her. And so I think for me, Te Tira Whakamātaki is my baby. It is very much how I see the world. And I see the world as a place that is trying to re-indigenise. And I believe that everyone is trying to re-indigenise and connect back to place and back to land, but also back to who they are as a person, where their values are, and that is about more than the individual. And so I don't know if I'm definitely not as articulate and as academic as Jess is, but I certainly have the same view, which is we need to shift the systems that we operate under. We need almost a revolution of governance in our lands. We need a revolution of the way we raise our children and the way we think about the environment around us. And everything in that revolution will be based in some form of indigeneity, whether that's indigeneity to this land as Māori or my indigeneity back to, my mum's motherland.
Part of my ancestry is also Irish Catholic, so yeah, we share that. So Tira Whakamātaki is also doing programs for youth. Can you share more about how you're expressing this work through TTW in that way?
Yeah, probably not as much as we would love to. There's always more work to do. I have a passion for seed banking as well, not necessarily seed banking for food like Jess and others do, but seed banking for conservation, so collecting those Kauri seeds so that we can have a next generation of Kauri trees, for example.
Nice.
And through our seed banking program, we're trying to engage the next generation of collectors and storers, and we run training all across the country on different levels, so just basic seed collecting so people can learn to identify, which is one of the most important things, is to identify what tree is what and to be able to name them, but also then how to go through the process of drying and storing and then being able to transfer that into their gardens so that they can also grow their own food. We have a growing Indigenous disaster network, so we do a lot of work in the disaster space as well, which is kind of my research background. And so we have many early career, young researchers coming through in that space who need support and want connections to communities to talk about what is our traditional knowledge around disasters, because we have a lot, but we've lost it, or it needs to be reclaimed. So we have a growing program in that space with young Māori researchers who are trying to, re-indigenize the disaster space as well. And then, of course, we just have lots of programs across the country working with communities, and we always say that we're the kaitonotono, so we're the servants or the helpers of our communities who are working at place to reconnect to their children. Back to their lands, back to their taonga, to their trees, their birds, their communities and their knowledge. And that might mean that we're on a marae one weekend and we're just running stories talking about, exactly as we have today, about Kauri Dieback and what that means for them, or how they can make the pani, they can make the oil, and how they can then go out and put it on the trees. So we do all sorts of programs, but they're always driven by our communities.
Right. Can you say more about this disaster work and your research there?
Yeah. When the Christchurch earthquakes hit, I was an academic at Lincoln University, and it was a really opportune time to, do hands-on disaster research as opposed to theoretical, how do disaster systems work. And my husband was a first responder in Christchurch, as was my brother. And so for my colleagues and I, it was a really, it was vital for us that we capture the stories of Māori. And so we did a couple of things to start off with, where we went into Māori communities and just exactly that, captured their stories. What's happening for you? How are you feeling? What do you think of the response? Are you getting what you need? How are you seeing the response happen around you? And that was really, of course, interesting and an amazing experience to be with people as they were responding, or as where they were trying to just survive, a disaster. And we saw some really interesting things come out of that work, where we found the most vulnerable communities on paper, so those in low socioeconomic areas, with all of the worst statistics you can imagine, being more resilient than those in the high affluent areas. So we saw quite often that Māori were resilient because they were used to struggles. They were used to not having help when they needed it. And yet when we would go into middle class or more affluent communities, they were struggling because they'd never been told no before. They'd never had an insurance company say, no, I'm not coming to fix your house, or no, you can't have your car back out of the garage. And so it was a really interesting story. But for me, more than anything, I was interested in system response, and I was interested in first responders, of course, selfishly because my husband was a first responder. But interestingly, I was interested in how Indigenous responders handle disasters, because there are some nuances that are different for others. And I don't know if there's a trigger warning for others, but from a Māori perspective, when you have a deceased person or a tūpapaku, then you don't ever leave them. They are never left on their own until the moment they go in, until they are buried. And so for many of our Māori first responders, having multiple victims that they couldn't stay with was quite...
interesting.
Yeah, it was a real tug on their cultural belief system, this inability to be able to stay with that person until someone else came, because they knew they had to move on and help someone else. So little nuances like that were really interesting for me. And we recorded a lot of stories about how Māori responders handled the Christchurch earthquakes. And then we found that was replicated across the world when we looked at other Indigenous responses. And we also found then it was replicated in North Island when cyclones would hit or floods would hit or other events would happen. But more than anything, what it also highlighted was the systemic problems we have in disaster management here in New Zealand, in terms of when decisions are made, who makes decisions, how communities are involved in their responses. And we saw, in Te Tira Whakamātaki in particular, lots of parallels between how disasters are managed and how biosecurity is managed, both of which are responses at pace to events that are unfolding. So biosecurity as an incursion is very much like a disaster. Something has arrived in our shores. We must eradicate really fast. We have to use all the systems and all the powers to do so at pace, even if that means we don't consult with communities. And you see that in places like Auckland, where in the past you've had planes fly over and dump, huge amounts of pesticides on communities without consultation, because we've been trying to eradicate, a pest. And in disasters, in the disaster space, we see the same, where often decisions are being made at a top-down and not taking into account what communities need, or even what first responders on the ground need. So.
Yeah, and there's that kind of Machiavellian political ideology, never let a disaster go to waste, or a crisis go to waste. And so many times we see these crises used as kind of an excuse to then implement, other forms of control.
Definitely.
So how do you think about that tension between, the need to preserve life and take care of people, but also that tension with balancing it with local community consultation and sovereignty and empowering people on the ground to really have their own say?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's as hard as our government agencies like to make it sound. And they will say that it's exactly that. We've got to balance life versus, all these other things. We've got to balance everything to ensure that we're making the best decision possible. But I do believe that communities always have their best interests at heart. I don't think that communities want to see people die.
Yep.
And I very much believe that in the climate space, we will only deal with climate change if communities are leading it. Disasters are the same. Communities come together to protect their own and to help people. And we see that the world over, when there's a big disaster, that it's the community response that lead the way. Kaikoura was a fantastic example of where Ngaitahu led the response for everyone, for the whole community. They didn't need government in there. They were feeding the community. They were housing them. So I do genuinely believe that communities lead the response anyway.
Yep.
The truth of it is that in a big disaster, the first 48 hours is what matters. If we think of the big earthquakes that have been in California, think of Hurricane Katrina and the likes, it's those first 48 hours when we save lives anyway. We also know, FEMA has told us, NEMA here has told us, that in that first 48 hours, the response services are going to be overwhelmed and they're not going to be able to respond.
Right.
So actually it is always going to be down to communities to save and protect their own. And so we just need to acknowledge that and start empowering communities to make the decisions about what matters for them, to protect what matters to them, to save their own lives, and to be prepared to do that. And so this is really just about devolving power. And that's the issue, is that people don't want to give up power. As you said, disasters are a really good time to exert power, to bring in reforms, to bring in changes to legislation that you might not get over the line any other time. COVID saw us do that. It saw the government bring in changes around access to marae. It allowed the government to access them anytime they wanted in a COVID response. So it's a time to bring through sweeping changes that you might not get over the line any other time. But ultimately, that's about power. And in true disasters, communities will always step up and they'll always respond the way they need to.
Yeah, I mean, coming from overseas into Aotearoa, I don't, this is like kind of somewhat anecdotal, but I'm curious what you think of it. Like I remember going to a climate action hui or symposium in Te Whanau several years ago, and I was maybe one of the only non-Māori people there, and I was still fairly new to the country, so it was definitely like a cultural immersion. And I just remember thinking like, wow, like the conversation is so much more rooted in adaptation and resilience and like teaching the young people how to actually survive on a changing planet. And similarly, like even just the way you language around disaster and preparedness and this, like it's a subtle feeling of this difference between maybe our default mainstream colonial Western, however you want to frame it, culture of the conversation around climate tending to be a bit more abstract, or biodiversity metrics or climate change or temperatures or whatnot. And then when I'm in conversation in more of a Māori community, I feel it more as like community survival, adaptation. And I don't know what that brings up for you, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think the difference is that it's not that reductionist view. So we're not just thinking about one thing, like what does this flood mean, for our marae? Is it going to wipe it out? We're thinking about what does it mean more broadly in terms of community survival, the place of our marae, but what does this also mean for the river, for nature around the river? So I think one of the reasons you hear a difference in language is that whole system thinking, the ecosystem thinking. But also, I suspect it's because communities, or Indigenous peoples in particular, don't have anywhere else to go. We're not Māori if we're not here on these lands. We're not whānau Apanui if we're not on those lands. So if we're not talking about how we adapt to remain at place, then we're talking about, in theory, an extinction of who we are. We're no longer going to be whānau Apanui. We're no longer going to be Māori. And that's playing out in very real time if you think about islands like Tuvalu. What does it mean when Tuvalu sinks beneath the ocean and all those people have to move somewhere? Are they still going to be, Tuvalu nation, just hosted somewhere else? Or are they going to cease to exist and become someone else? And I think when you're on a marae or in a Māori space, we're constantly thinking about that. We're thinking about future generations and whether we will still be here, whether our children will have the opportunity to be kahanunu like I am, to understand what that means to be of this place, and this place in particular, and to have the connection to how this land has changed and the stories that our ancestors have told us and shared with us from this place. So I think that's what you hear and the differences, as opposed to how do I address this problem? This climate change is a real big issue. So is biodiversity loss. How do I measure it? And in part, I have a bit of sympathy for science in that, scientists themselves are genuinely good people who really want to find solutions. They really want to do the right thing. They want to address climate change and biodiversity loss, but they're so focused on counting everything and measuring everything and doing that in isolation from the rest of the planet or the rest of the community or everything else that's happening in the biodiversity space or in the environmental space that they're operating in, that they sometimes forget to look up, and they're focused on the tree and not the forest. And I think that's what we see, and where we see the clash between Māori environmental practices and non-Māori environmental practices is often that, am I looking at the tree or am I looking at the forest? And am I thinking about keeping this forest forever, or what it might look like in 7 generations versus just what it will look like in 20 years' time, and what it might mean for me as an individual and what it might mean for my business? I think that may be what you're seeing.
So you referenced the seeds, and that's also a big part of the kōrero that we had with Jessica.
Yeah.
But can you share more about what's happening in that space, and then with this GMO conversation that's very present? Yeah,
with the caveat that I'm not a GMO expert like Jess and many others, and I've kind of been dragged kicking and screaming into the GMO space. Seeds are a passion of ours as well, and I think they're a passion of everyone's, because if we think about seeds, they're not only the foundation of life on planet and everything that we do, everything we eat, everything we wear, the air that we breathe and the like, but they're also something that humans have been collecting for almost 5,000 years now, I think. So the first records of seed collecting are about 3,000 BC. So for us in our space, seeds are a link to our ancestors. They're also a link to our stories of where we've been as a people and where we're going. So they're a reminder of our journeys across the Pacific Ocean as well, and all the places we've been and what we've collected on the way. So one, they're a part of our practice, but two, they're vital for biodiversity restoration and for genetic diversity, which is going to be crucial, I believe, in responding to climate change, ensuring we have as much diversity as possible. So we have a real passion for upskilling our communities on how to collect and how to store. And in particular for us, storing at place is important. It's all well and good to send our seeds overseas, to the Millennium Seed Bank in London or to the Slavard Seed Bank in Norway. But when, it all goes to hell in a handbasket, it's a really long way to go to get your seeds.
Yep.
So we have a real passion for having seeds at place and at home. And it comes probably from a couple of experiences for us. One was we went to the seed bank here in New Zealand and our elders came with us. And I think in their heads they were imagining this, beautiful facility with these beautiful seeds laid out, because seeds are their brothers and sisters. They're connected to them, where they'd all be, in pristine bottles and the like. And we got there and it wasn't that. It wasn't anything near that. It was probably, the furthest thing you can imagine. It was a cupboard in the back of a shack. And our seeds were literally just, in plastic bags lined up in a box. And it was really devastating for our people. And I remember walking out of the room, out of the shack, and one of our elders was in tears. She was very much like, this is not what I expected. I've been to the Millennium Seed Bank in the UK, and, seeds there are treated like they are a tongue or a treasure. And so for us, it resonated this need to really have control over our seeds and the way they're looked after. And then the other experience was also having a conversation with a New Zealand scientist who is very involved in international seed banks. And they said to us that they had an experience offshore where an Indigenous group had brought seeds to them. And they had turned up in all their traditional regalia into a very, very cold place, so at the top of the world. And they had very ornate carved boxes with their seeds in it. And when they turned up and presented their seeds to the seed bank was really disappointed to find only 2 seeds in this carved ornate box. And they were telling us that story as a way of saying, well, you need more seeds. 2 is not enough. And, there was all this fanfare around it, but actually what they presented us wasn't enough. And of course, we looked at that and were very much saying, well, they've turned up with their babies. This is all they've got to offer you. This is so important to them that they've turned up in their ceremonial gear to hand it over. So it was a reminder of the difference in the worldview and how we treat and see seeds. They were seeing it as a commercial venture, something that had to be done for conservation practice or agricultural practice, whereas we were seeing it as very much about protecting our legacy and protecting our whakapapa, our genealogy. And so it resonated for us the need to really build seed infrastructure that's fit for purpose here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that took into consideration Māori values around seeds, but also took into consideration the legalities around who owns seeds and who should make decisions about seeds here. And under Te Tiriti o Waitangi, our founding document of this country and the agreement between Crown and Māori about how we would cohabitate together, we believe that seeds are sit under Article 2 of the treaty, and that Māori have the decision-making rights or responsibilities of how seeds are treated, stored, and who owns them. And so our program is really threefold. It's not only about building the capacity of our people to collect and store our seeds, it's also about challenging and building new infrastructure, so building seed banks in community at the marae so that they can keep their babies at home, as well as, regional facilities where we can do much needed seed research. But it's also the legal end of it, challenging the Crown in particular and Crown Research Institutes around who should be making decisions about what seeds are held, where they're held, and who can access them and use them.
And Aotearoa, New Zealand has been a non-GMO country, one of the last ones. But the but the winds are blowing, and it looks like that's shifting. Can you say more about these issues and how you're sitting with them?
Yeah, well, it's really clear that our new government will change the rules around GMO and gene technology more broadly. They've made it very clear that that's their desire. They, have a policy called Harnessing Biotech or something similar, and they have made moves to establish a new gene regulator by the end of this calendar year, and that is their response to opening the market in part to new research and new solutions. They would argue to some of our big environmental problems like climate change. So the arguments behind it are, how can we create new ryegrasses that might help reduce carbon, or how can we open up technology to potentially eradicate the possum, for example. Mm-hmm. So they're looking at a broad suite of GMO technologies or genetic technologies, everything from human health right through to conservation. But they're doing so at such a fast pace that it's will risk leaving the community behind. And we know in New Zealand that when we have conversations about gene technologies and GMOs, and we've had them in the past, that things blow up pretty quickly. We've just recently completed a survey at Tira Whakamātaki and shared all that on our website, where we've asked communities, Māori in particular, what their views are around gene technology and GMOs. And largely it hasn't shifted in the last 10 or 20 years. People are still, by and large, anti anything that changes the DNA of a species or impacts what we call the mauri or the whakapapa. So whether it impacts the essence of it, its spirit, or its genealogy, most of our communities are anti it. So there is the potential that these new rules that the government are pushing through are driven by a small minority, a squeaky wheel of industry and researchers who want to deregulate and also speed up the system in terms of getting approvals to even do, I guess, trials in controlled environments. But they're doing that without communities. And largely you can't do it, we shouldn't be ethically doing it without communities, but also communities will push back. I remember in the 90s, I think, there was a new research centre established at Lincoln University, which was loosely looking at GMOs, very, very light examination of GMOs, and they had, they were firebombed. People were setting fires to their trial sites, their field sites. And so we know that there's this element of New Zealand society that will push back quite aggressively. And so I just can't understand why we would be pushing ahead so rapidly without bringing them along on the journey with us. It just seems, really strange.
Wow. I mean, you're holding so much, Mel. I mean, you've taken it upon yourself with your community to ensure that there's Māori-led research happening and that there's kind of a lens into biosecurity and the watchful ones, from an Indigenous perspective, and protecting the taonga of the seeds, and, thinking about these political struggles. And yeah, I'm just curious, what gives you energy and resilience to keep going with the mahi?
Yeah, good question. Some days I ask myself that. Well, first and foremost, I'm a mum, and as I was saying to you before, I'm a taua, so that's the Māori name for a nana. And so, of course, I'm driven, like many people, by this desire to create a better world for my kids and now my grandchild. And any other future grandchildren I might have. But I'm also very mindful that of who I am and where I come from. And so we have this phrase, which when I was talking about Australia before, I called it Te Whenua Moemoea, which means the land of dreaming, which is the name we've given them. But Moemoea is like your dream, or a queer, an elder woman once described it to me as the gift you are given when you're born that's in your DNA for who you're meant to be and what you're meant to do. So it's your soul's purpose in life. And I am always been relatively clear that I come from particular ancestors, and I come from over the hill in Papawai, which was the home of the very first Māori Parliament, the Kotahitanga movement. I come from people who are very much wedded in protecting our environment. One of my grandfathers taught himself to be a surveyor so that he could survey in front of the Crown and protect our land. So I come from, I guess, ancestors who have always been about fighting the system, challenging the status quo, protecting what we value and the things that define us and make us who we are as Māori or as kahanunu or as Ngāti Porou or Aotearoa. And so I think that that's what drives me, is this innate sense of who I am and my purpose here in the time that I'm here, and what I need to give back to this land that sustains me and to my ancestors who came before me and created this space. And then outside of that, our family's just obsessed in music. So that's what also drives us. When it all goes to hell in a handbasket, we just turn the radio on, break out the guitars, do something, and just have a bit of a sing-song.
Nice.
So things like that, yeah. And I love my garden. So if it's really, really bad, you'll just find me in my veggie garden. Yeah, ignoring the world.
Beautiful. How do people engage with the work? What kind of support is most useful? How do people get involved?
Yeah, well, definitely people can follow us on our socials and check out our website, which is really easy. It's ttw.nz. But on there, we also have resources for communities. So part of our job is to educate others and to help others, learn about things Māori or to learn about the environment or learn about new technologies. So there's resources there for people to use, and we really want them to pick them up and to use them either in their community groups or in their schools or even in their homes if they're trying to, decolonise themselves and their families. But they can also follow us on our socials. And more than anything for us, I've always been really clear that our job is to be what we call translators or supporters of our communities. So we really just want people to support our communities, the Māori groups that are all across the country on the ground doing the mahi, restoring our environment, cleaning our waterways, eradicating pests as much as we have to. And so just by going through us, finding those people and connecting to them and supporting them is vital. And as we've said before earlier on, many of them are struggling going forward. They're losing their funding from the government, but we can't afford to lose them on the ground doing the work. So any support that people can throw towards those groups is useful for us as well.
Beautiful. Yeah. We'll put links in the show notes.
Yeah.
Any final messages you'd like to share?
Yeah, that's a hard question, isn't it? Years and years ago, my research partner Simon Lambert and I talked about re-indigenising humanity, and I know that phrase has some connotations that other Indigenous people, researchers, don't like because they don't think that everyone can try and claim indigeneity. And I know you had a conversation with Jess in part about that. But I guess my closing comment is that I do genuinely believe that, we were all Indigenous. We were all Indigenous once upon a time from a place and a space. Something connects us to land or waterways elsewhere. But more than anything, the indigeneity that we all need to reconnect to is how we feel about place, how we see the world, those value sets that drive us, what it means to live in a collective space and to think about people around us and beyond ourselves. And so I guess my closing comment is think about how you re-indigenize yourself and your family in ways that more than anything protect Papa Tūānuku.
Yeah. Melanie Mark-Shadbolt, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right, I trust you got something of value from that conversation with Melanie. To engage more deeply in her work and learn more about the frontline communities she referenced, just go to ttw.nz. You might also be interested in our kōrero with Dr. Jessica Hutchings, as well as Erin Matariki Carr. Links are in the show notes, and all of our conversations are hosted at maearth.com. We are here to elevate voices of the regenerative economy movement. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, as it helps us get the word out further. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.